Have you ever noticed how the people making the rules always seem to assume everyone else's life is the same as theirs? Just bring your documents. Just get a passport. Just pay the fee. Just take a day off of work. Just. It's amazing how simple everything sounds when none of the obstacles apply to you. Hello all. You're listening to Your Neighbor on the Left, the podcast where we talk about liberal politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, and I am your host. I doubt that there is anyone out there at this point who doesn't already know what the SAVE Act is. You've heard about it, you've seen the arguments, you've seen the news reports, you've probably watched people go back and forth about it online like it's just another one of those political food fights. But it's high time that we slowed this down for just a minute or two. Because this is not just another policy disagreement. This is one of those moments where the fine print matters much more than the headline. And when you really sit with it, when you walk through what this actually does in the real world, it starts to look less like election security and a lot more like something that could fundamentally reshape who gets to participate in our democracy. I'm going to put this as bluntly and succinctly as I can. The SAVE Act is the biggest threat to election rights this country has seen in decades, possibly in its entire 250-year history. The Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act is being pitched in the simplest terms possible, in one of two ways. Require proof of citizenship to vote, or require voter ID. That's it. One of those two lines is the sales pitch. Clean, simple, reasonable sounding. And that simplicity is doing a lot of work. Because buried underneath those two nice, neat sentences is a very, very different reality. Let's start with something that we should all agree on. Only U.S. citizens should vote in elections. That is not controversial. That is already the law. Non-citizen voting is illegal. It has been illegal. If someone does it, their vote does not count, and they are prosecuted for a felony. When an undocumented immigrant does this, they are also subject to deportation. That is the reality of where we stand without any additional legislation. So right away, we're talking about solving a problem that does not exist. We're talking about adding a new, unnecessary layer on top of something that is already illegal. And that should raise a question. If we don't need this to actually prevent non-citizens from voting, why the hell are we doing it? If there were widespread evidence that non-citizens were voting in large numbers, you could at least understand the urgency. You might still debate the solution, but the problem would be real and clear. But that is not reality. That is not what the data shows. Not even close. Even the Heritage Foundation, the ultra-right conservative think tank, which has spent years trying to document voter fraud, has only been able to point to a very small number of cases over a very long period of time. We're not talking about elections being swung. We're not talking about coordinated fraud of any kind. We're talking about isolated incidents. The kind of numbers that barely register in a country of over 330 million people. I'm going to go one step further. Have you ever heard anyone, the president, a legislator, a talking head on the news, anyone, ever provide actual proof of what they're claiming this bill is needed for? No, you have not. Anyone who has heard this is encouraged to reach out to this podcast and let me know. If you do, I guarantee I will include it in a future episode. So anyway, we're in this strange position now. We have a law designed to address a problem that is, by every credible measure, extremely rare. And the solution being proposed is not small. It's not surgical. It's not targeted. It is sweeping. Because under the SAVE Act, registering to vote would require documentary proof of citizenship. Not a signed statement, not a checkbox on a form, actual documents. A passport, a birth certificate, naturalization papers. No documents, no registration. No registration, no vote. Now here's where the conversation usually goes sideways. Because someone will say, well, they're just documents. Like it's that simple. Like it's a quick errand. Like you just swing by Walmart on your way home and pick up a passport while you're grabbing a gallon of milk. And this is where I think we need to get very, very honest. That mindset, whether people realize it or not, is rooted in a level of comfort that not everyone shares. Let's talk about cost. Because this part tends to get brushed off, or minimized at least, waved away like it's nothing. A replacement birth certificate can cost anywhere from $20 to $50, depending on the state. A passport, you're looking at roughly $165 to $200 once you factor in fees. Now, one thing that all of the folks I mentioned earlier, the president, members of Congress, TV news personalities, all of them have this in common, is that they are financially comfortable. This matters. Because if you're financially comfortable, you hear those dollar amounts and you think, yeah, that's annoying, but whatever. Minor inconvenience, one-time thing, no big deal. But if you're living paycheck to paycheck, if you're choosing between groceries and gas, if you're one small stumble away from being homeless due to today's ridiculous housing costs, if you're already stretching every dollar just to stay afloat, it is not a minor convenience. It's a barrier, and it's a real one. And this part doesn't get said enough. When people on the right, or honestly anyone for that matter, dismiss those costs as trivial, they are, intentionally or not, revealing something. Because to call $50 or $200 no big deal is to assume that everyone has that kind of flexibility, and millions of Americans do not. It is based on a particular, albeit subtle, form of elitism. What we're really talking about here is just not documentation anyway. It's a paywall, not an official one. It doesn't say anywhere, pay to vote, but something that would absolutely function that way for a lot of people. And when access to voting starts depending on whether you can afford the required paperwork, we have got a problem. Not least of which is, it is illegal to have a system where somebody has to pay to vote. But it doesn't stop at money. There's also the issue of time, transportation, bureaucracy, the ability to leave work or call in absent from work in order to take care of these things. Government offices that may not be nearby. Replacing documents that may not even currently exist in a clean, easy to retrieve form. Now, these groups I'm going to mention next are probably ones that you've heard mentioned. Think about elderly Americans who were born at home and were never issued formal birth certificates. Think about women whose last names changed after marriage, and now those names don't match their original documents. Think about people who've lost paperwork over decades of moving and life changes. Think about victims of past disasters, fires, tornadoes, hurricanes, so on and so forth. These are not edge cases. These are real people. Millions of real people. And when you stack all of this together, you start to see the shape of the impact, because these barriers don't hit everyone equally. They fall hardest on lower income Americans, non-white voters, women, urban populations, groups that statistically tend to lean left. Now, at this point, some people will say, okay, but that's not intentional. Maybe, maybe not. But here's the thing about policy. Intent matters, of course it does, but impact matters much more. And when the impact is predictable, it's fair to ask questions about motive, especially when you zoom out and look at the broader political context. When you consider conversations that are happening around things like Project 2025, where reshaping institutions and consolidating power are not exactly hidden goals, especially when this push is being spearheaded by one party and it's happening in an election year with control of Congress on the line. Let me be blunt again. If you can make it substantially harder for groups that tend to vote for your opponent, you no longer have to change minds. You just have to change turnout. And then there's the messaging, because this is where things get outright manipulative. If you oppose the SAVE Act, the response you're going to hear is, oh, so you're against voter ID. Oh, you support non-citizens voting. You're okay with fraud. That framing is incredibly effective because it simplifies a complex issue into a yes or no moral test. But as it turns out, it's also deeply and intentionally misleading, because this is not about basic voter ID, which is already required in more states than not. This is about requiring specific, subjectively costly, and possibly difficult to obtain citizenship documents at the registration stage. That is a very different conversation. And then we get to something that should probably be getting a lot more attention. President Trump had this to say when speaking at a Republican retreat at his Mar-a-Lago estate.
They're doing everything possible because they know if we get this, they probably won't win an election for 50 years, okay? And maybe longer.
Now, of course, the they that he was referring to are the Democrats or the Democratic Party. And just recently, Mike Johnson, Republican Speaker of the House, was caught on a hot mic admitting in a conversation this bill would cause the number of people who could conceivably not be able to vote would be, in his own words, huge for us. Now think about that. If a law about election integrity results in one party potentially being locked out of power for decades, if the very possible effects of the bill would be seen as huge for one side, what is the law really doing? In a healthy democracy, the goal is not to engineer outcomes. It's to reflect the will of the voters, all of the voters, not just the ones who can clear a set of financial and bureaucratic hurdles. However minor or substantial those hurdles might be, that is not how the right to vote is supposed to work in this country. When you step back and you look at this whole thing, here's what you see. A minuscule problem being used to justify a massive change. A requirement that sounds simple but becomes complicated in real life. Costs that are dismissed as trivial, but absolutely are not for millions of Americans. Messaging that blurs the truth. Barriers that, as admitted to by Republican leaders, fall unevenly across the population. And timing that raises some very serious questions. That's why this matters. This isn't just about paperwork. It's about access. It's about who gets to participate. It's about whether we're quietly moving toward a system where voting is technically a right, but practically a privilege. And once you start going down that road, how much imagination do you really have to use to see where it leads? So yeah, everybody's heard of the SAVE Act. But some folks are being obviously disingenuous about its effects. And some people have not really thought through what it means when you zoom out. To look at the people on the other side of those requirements. The ones who don't have the documents, don't have the extra money, don't have the free time. Because those people, they're not statistics. They are voters. They are American voters. Or at least they're supposed to be. All right, everyone. Thank you for downloading and listening to this episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. I would really love to have you guys reach out and tell me what you think about all of this. And particularly for any of those of you who might be listening and fall in favor of the SAVE Act, if you have seen or heard any sources that prove to you the aspects of voter fraud and non-citizen voting that the right is talking about when they discuss this bill, I want you to reach out to me and let me know where you are seeing this or where you are reading this. And if you do, I will talk about these on a future episode. I will look them up for myself and discuss what they have to say. If you go to the website for the podcast, www.neighborontheleft.com, you will find a contacts page. You can reach out to the podcast by messaging on any of the social media platforms that the podcast uses. There is also an email address there where you can email the podcast directly with your questions or your comments, or, as I said, any information that you know to the contrary of what I have been talking about in this episode. Also on the website is a web player where you can listen to or download any episode of the podcast going all the way back to the beginning. And there is also a blog section where I post blog entries that mirror the things that I talk about in the various episodes. And these blog posts include the sources that I'm using. All right, so now with the new release schedule that I mentioned in the last episode, the next episode will be Friday. It will be an installment of Back Porch Files. So I hope that you'll take the time to download and listen to that. And between now and then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.